To the world, Marcus Thorne was not a man. He was a skyline. His name was etched in steel and glass on over a dozen of Manhattan's most expensive buildings. He was the Steel King of New York, a self-made billionaire who had clawed his way up from the docks of Staten Island with calloused hands and a ruthless mind. His greatest acquisition, however, wasn't a building. It was his wife, Seraphina Thorne. Tonight, at the annual Thorne Foundation Gala, they were the picture of American royalty. Marcus, in a brutally simple, multi-thousand-dollar tuxedo, watched his wife glide through the crowd. She was dazzling, draped in a cascade of emeralds that matched her eyes, her blonde hair coiled in a perfect, elegant knot. She was old money Grace, the one thing he could never build, only acquire. He smiled, raising his glass to her from across the ballroom. She smiled back, a perfect, practiced smile. But her eyes weren't looking at him. They were looking past him, toward the man standing at his side. The man was Julian Vance. He was the Foundation's new, brilliant art curator, and he was everything Marcus was not. Julian was tall, with the languid grace of inherited wealth, a perfectly unstudied wave in his dark hair. He spoke 5 languages and wore his suits with a casual European flair. Marcus just owned the museum wing they were standing in. "She is magnificent, isn't she?" Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. He clapped Julian on the shoulder, but the gesture wasn't friendly. The grip was hard, a proprietary claim on the man, the room, and the wife. Julian's gaze snapped back from Seraphina. He gave Marcus a smooth, charismatic smile, artfully ignoring the pressure on his shoulder. "She is the heart of this foundation, Marcus. An inspiration." Marcus nodded, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he released his grip. That she is. Marcus Thorne, who had built an empire by spotting weakness, had just seen a flicker of it. It was a look. A glance held a microsecond too long. It was nothing. And it was everything. The lies started small. "I'm visiting the new Impressionist exhibit for the Foundation," Seraphina would say, her voice light and breezy over the phone. She was at the museum, but she was in the private archives, a cavernous, climate-controlled room where the public was never allowed, standing far too close to Julian. "This piece," Julian whispered, gesturing to a small, unassuming canvas. "It's a forgery, a brilliant one." "How can you tell?" Seraphina asked, her voice breathy. "You have to look past the signature," he murmured, his hand hovering over the canvas. "You look for the flaw, the tiny human error. Everyone makes one." His dark eyes held hers. His words weren't just about the painting. Seraphina, who had lived a flawless, controlled, perfect life as Marcus's acquisition, felt an intoxicating thrill. She was the flaw in his perfect steel and glass collection. And for the first time in a decade, she felt beautifully, dangerously human. She arrived home late, the scent of museum archives and Julian's expensive cologne on her skin. Marcus was waiting up, reading a financial report. "Good exhibit?" he asked, not looking up. "Fascinating," she lied, kissing the air near his cheek. Marcus Thorne didn't get to where he was by being a fool. He was a patient man. He'd waited 7 years to buy the land for his flagship tower. He could wait for this. His suspicion from the gala had been a quiet alarm. Now he needed confirmation. He didn't hire a private investigator. It was too crude, too messy. He simply audited. He watched the Foundation's expense accounts. A private dinner with a donor at a restaurant with a reputation for discretion. 2 guests. He watched his wife's car service. Long, unexplained stops in Soho, near Julian's private loft. He watched his wife. She was different, happier. She was glowing, radiant. It made his stomach clench. She was using his money, his security, his life as a gilded cage to conduct her affair. The disrespect was a cold stone in his gut. He finally found it. A burner phone hidden in the back of her designer handbag drawer, tucked inside a dust bag for a purse she hadn't carried in years. It was arrogant. It was sloppy. It was the human error. Marcus opened the phone. He didn't need a password. They were too arrogant. The messages were all there. "Julian, he's a brute. He wouldn't know a Rembrandt from a placemat." "Seraphina, He just buys things. There's no soul. You have a soul. Julian, he'll be in Chicago next week, the full 48 hours. The penthouse is ours. Seraphina, I can't wait. I feel alive. Marcus stared at the words until they burned into his memory. A brute. He closed the phone, his hand steady. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel sadness. He felt the same cold, calculating calm he felt during a hostile takeover. This was no longer a marriage. It was a hostile acquisition. And he was about to orchestrate the most brutal, leveraged buyout of his career. He made 2 calls. The first was to his head of security. I want an audiovisual team in the penthouse, full spectrum, and I want it done in the next 3 hours. The second was to a man he kept on retainer, a fixer who specialized in making problems disappear. I need you to dig into an art curator named Julian Vance. I don't care about his affairs. I care about his accounts. The revenge had begun. It wasn't just going to cost her everything. It was going to cost her herself. The Gulfstream jet, a $70 million marvel of engineering, cut through the night sky toward Chicago. Marcus Thorne wasn't in the plush leather seat. He was in the jet's private office, a small, soundproofed room. In front of him wasn't the spreadsheet for the merger he was supposed to be reviewing. It was a multi-panel display, streaming a live, high-definition feed from 4 hidden cameras in his own penthouse. He watched. He was a statue, his face illuminated only by the glow of the screens. He watched Seraphina arrive. He watched Julian arrive a few minutes later. He watched them embrace a desperate, greedy kiss just inside the foyer, under the multi-million-dollar chandelier he had paid for. His head of security, a grim-faced man named Hannon, sat in the corner, silent. "Volume, Hannon," Marcus said, his voice a dead calm. The audio, crisp and clear, filled the cabin. "I missed you. I can't stand when he... brute." Marcus nodded slowly. "Stay on the feed. Log every word. I'll be in the main cabin." He walked out of the office, his posture perfect. He sat in his leather chair, opened the merger spreadsheet, and buzzed the flight attendant. "Whiskey," he ordered, "and wake me on approach." He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to calculate. Back in New York, the penthouse felt like theirs. It was the heart of Marcus's power, his fortress of solitude, and they were defiling it with glee. Seraphina laughed, a real, unrestrained laugh that echoed off the 30-foot glass windows overlooking Central Park. "He's such a fool, Julian," she said, sipping champagne that cost more than a used car. "He flies to Chicago to buy another building, another piece of the world, and he doesn't even see what's happening in his own home." "He's not a fool, my love," Julian murmured, unfastening the emerald necklace from her throat. "He's just uninspired. He collects, but he doesn't see." He ran his fingers along her collarbone. "This necklace, it's exquisite, but it's wasted on him. He sees it as an asset. I see it as a frame for your skin." They moved from the living room, leaving a trail of expensive clothes, their arrogance a palpable force. They were so sure of their cleverness, so wrapped in their passion, that they never once saw the tiny pinprick lenses in the smoke detectors or the artfully hidden microphone in the base of a bronze statue. They were the flaw, a human error, performing for an audience of one. The next morning, as Marcus was in his Chicago hotel suite preparing for a meeting he had no intention of focusing on, his burner phone buzzed. It was a text from his fixer. "We have him." A single email arrived a moment later. It was a full dossier on Julian Vance. Marcus read, and for the first time a cold smile touched his lips. Julian wasn't old money. He was the son of a failed accountant from Ohio. His European flair was an accent he'd practiced. His art history degree was from a diploma mill. He was a con artist, a very, very good one. The report was meticulous. Julian had a history of charming, wealthy, lonely women. He had massive gambling debts in Macau and a string of shell corporations he used to authenticate and sell forgeries, often to the very foundations he worked for. He wasn't just sleeping with Seraphina. He was robbing her, and by extension he was robbing Marcus. Julian, he just buys things, there's no soul. Marcus closed the laptop. "Oh, Julian," he whispered to the empty room. "You're about to learn what it costs to steal from a king." When Marcus returned to New York, Seraphina played the part of the dutiful wife perfectly. She had the penthouse filled with his favorite flowers and had his favorite meal waiting. She greeted him at the door, her smile bright, her eyes clear. The performance was flawless. "How was Chicago, darling?" she asked, adjusting his tie. "Did you buy the skyline?" "Something like that," Marcus said, allowing her to kiss his cheek. He looked over her shoulder at the bronze statue in the foyer. He could almost hear their voices. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's good to be home. I missed you." Seraphina's relief was visible. He had suspected nothing. She was safe. "I missed you too, Marcus, terribly." "Good," he said, taking her hand. "Because I need to discuss something with you. It's about the foundation." A flicker of panic in her eyes. "Oh, is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," Marcus said, leading her to the living room. "I'm just making some adjustments." He smiled, and she felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. It was the smile he used right before he bankrupted a competitor. The next morning, Seraphina woke up alone. She found a note on Marcus's pillow. "Meeting with the lawyers, don't wait up." She shrugged it off and went about her day. Her first stop was her favorite boutique on Madison Avenue. She picked out a dress, a purse, and a pair of shoes. Total, $28,000. She handed the clerk her platinum card. A moment later, the clerk returned, her face pale. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thorne. The card has been declined." Seraphina laughed. "That's impossible. Run it again." "I did, ma'am, 3 times. It's declined, all of them." Panic, cold and sharp, shot through her. She tried her debit card, declined, her foundation credit card, declined. She called the bank. A polite, robotic voice informed her that her accounts were under a temporary security freeze. She called Marcus. It went straight to voicemail. She was standing on Madison Avenue, draped in emeralds and silk, and she didn't have enough money for a taxi. The gilded cage had just slammed shut. Humiliation burned Seraphina's cheeks, hotter than the afternoon sun. She, Seraphina Thorne, whose face graced a dozen charity boards, was forced to walk 30 blocks back to the penthouse in her towering $1,000 heels. Each click-clack on the pavement felt like a separate indignity. When she finally pushed through the lobby, the doorman, who usually bowed, she stormed into the penthouse. "Marcus!" He was in his study, sitting in the dark, a single glass of whiskey on his desk. He looked up, his face an unreadable mask of calm. "My cards," she said, her voice shaking with a rage she hadn't earned. "They're declined, all of them." "What did you do?" Marcus swirled the ice in his glass. "It's a simple security measure, Seraphina. A precaution." "A precaution for what? I was stranded. I had to walk." "Was that it?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Just stranded? I found some irregularities in the Foundation's accounts. I've initiated a full internal audit. All non-essential assets have been frozen, including secondary cardholder accounts." He took a slow sip. "Yours were secondary." The word audit landed like a bomb. She thought of Julian. She thought of the donor dinners. Her anger evaporated, replaced by a sudden, icy dread. Seraphina fled to her dressing room, her hands shaking. She fumbled for the dust bag in her drawer and pulled out the burner phone. She pressed the power button. Nothing. She tried again. The screen remained black. The battery was dead, or it had been remotely wiped. A new, more primal panic set in. This wasn't just about money. She changed into flats, grabbed a designer purse, one she'd paid for in cash years ago, and hurried out of the penthouse, past the silent doorman. She took a taxi to Julian's Soho loft, her heart hammering against her ribs. She buzzed. No answer. She buzzed again, holding the button down. Finally, the doorman emerged. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "It's Seraphina Thorne. I'm here to see Mr. Vance." The doorman, who had accepted $1,000 holiday tips from her, gave her a blank, cold stare. "Mr. Vance checked out this morning. Left no forwarding address." "Checked out? That's his home," she insisted. "It's a leased property, ma'am. From Thorne Industries, I believe." He held the door open, not for her, but for another resident. "Have a good day." She was locked out. The cage wasn't just at home, it was the whole city. The next day was the quarterly board meeting for the Thorne Foundation. Seraphina had to go. Her name was on the charter. To miss it would be an admission of guilt. She walked into the boardroom, her head held high. though she had done her own hair and makeup for the first time in a decade. The room was silent. The other board members, all old money titans and society matrons, stared at their papers. Marcus was at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming. We have a serious matter to discuss." He didn't mention her. He announced a full-scale internal audit, citing significant financial irregularities and potential art acquisition fraud. "To that end," Marcus said, gesturing to a woman at the end of the table, "I've brought in Ms. Davies, a forensic accountant from a private firm, to oversee the investigation. She will have full access to all foundation records, expenses, and correspondence. No exceptions." Ms. Davies, a sharp woman with severe glasses, looked directly at Seraphina. The message was clear. This wasn't an audit. It was an interrogation. The board members shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between Marcus and his wife. The scandal had begun. In a roach-infested motel in Queens, Julian Vance was watching his life dissolve. His bank accounts were gone. His offshore holdings, which he thought were so cleverly hidden, were locked down. He tried to call his contacts in Macau. The numbers were disconnected. He was a con man with no one left to con. Marcus's fixer hadn't just found his debts, he'd bought them. Julian was no longer just a gambler in the red. He was a man who owed money to some of the most dangerous people in the world, and Marcus Thorne now held his markers. He was furious. He had underestimated the brute. He used his last few dollars to buy a prepaid burner and called Seraphina's main number. "You have to help me," he hissed when she picked up, her voice a terrified whisper. "Julian, where are you? He knows. He's frozen everything." "I know he has. He's trying to ruin me." "You have to get me money, Seraphina, real money, cash or jewelry. Those emeralds you wore. Get them. Get them now, or I swear I will tell him everything." It was the desperate, ugly plea of a cornered rat. The man with the soul was gone. Seraphina hung up, shaking. Julian was threatening her. Marcus was hunting her. She was trapped between the two men. She walked into the study. Marcus was there, as if he'd been waiting. "That was Julian," she said, her voice small. She wasn't confessing, she was testing. Marcus didn't even flinch. "I know. My security team flagged a call from a burner in Queens. He's demanding money, I assume." Seraphina stared, horrified. You were listening?" "I am listening to everything, Seraphina. I have been for weeks." He stood up and walked to his desk, pulling out a file. He tossed it in front of her. It was the complete dossier on Julian Vance, the forgeries, the gambling, the other women. "He's a con artist, Seraphina. He wasn't having an affair with you. He was defrauding you. He was stealing from my foundation, from me." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "I don't care about your pathetic, sordid little romance. I care about my money and my name. So here's your choice. You will be my star witness. You will help me recover every single dollar he stole. Or you will be named as his co-conspirator in the federal indictment. Choose." Seraphina's world had shrunk to the space between two terrible options. On one side, a con artist who saw her as a disposable asset. On the other, a husband who saw her as a disloyal one. Julian, the man with the soul, had threatened her. Marcus, the brute, had offered her a path to survival. The choice was disgustingly, sickeningly clear. What do I have to do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words tasted like ash. A cold, thin smile of triumph touched Marcus's lips. He didn't celebrate. He simply processed her surrender. "You will do exactly as I say. You will call him. You will arrange a meeting. You will lure him in with the promise of what he wants. He wants the emeralds," she breathed, her hand instinctively going to her throat, which was bare. "Then you will promise him the emeralds," Marcus replied, as if discussing a simple business transaction. "You are now my most valuable asset in this recovery, Seraphina. Act like it." He leaned back, the mask of the husband gone, replaced by the calculating face of the CEO. "Don't disappoint me, you won't like the consequences." The next 24 hours were a master class in psychological control. Marcus moved Seraphina from their master bedroom to a guest suite at the other end of the penthouse. It was still luxurious, but it was a cage. He reactivated one of her credit cards, but she discovered the limit was a paltry $5,000, just enough for taxis and food, not enough to run. It was a digital leash. He and Hannon, his head of security, sat with her, coaching her on the phone call. "You must sound terrified," Marcus instructed, his voice devoid of emotion. "Terrified of me. Tell him I'm watching you, that you're a prisoner. It has the benefit of being true. Tell him you have the emeralds, that you managed to hide them, and they're your only leverage to escape. He's a greedy, desperate man. His greed will make him stupid." Seraphina looked at this man she had been married to for a decade. He was a stranger. He was analyzing her lover's weaknesses with the same detached precision he used on a stock portfolio. She was no longer his wife. She was his bait. She made the call from the study with Marcus and Hannon listening on speakerphone. Her hand shook so violently she could barely hold the burner Hannon had provided. "Julian," she cried, injecting a practiced hysteria into her voice. "Thank heavens, I can't talk long." "Seraphina, did you get them?" Julian's voice was sharp, ugly, all the manufactured charm gone. Yes, she whispered. He doesn't know I have them. He took everything, Julian, but I have the emeralds. They're all I have left." "Where are you?" he demanded. "I'm in the penthouse. I'm a prisoner. He's watching me. But he's at a meeting downtown tomorrow at 3. I can get out for 1 hour. A pause. He was thinking, weighing the risk against the reward. The emeralds were worth millions. "Where?" he finally snapped. "The Illyrian Gallery in Chelsea," she said, reading from Marcus's script. The one we visited in the back room. Please, Julian, we have to go. Together." 3 o'clock, he said and hung up. Marcus nodded, satisfied. "Good, you're a natural, my dear. A very convincing liar." The next day, Seraphina's stomach was a knot of acid. She had one more performance to give. To make the lure believable, she had to retrieve the emeralds. She walked to the massive steel-plated door of their private vault, hidden behind a paneled wall in the study. Hannon stood 10 feet away, watching. Marcus was gone, already at his meeting. Seraphina entered the complex 16-digit code. She placed her thumb on the biometric scanner. The heavy door hissed and swung open. She stepped inside, expecting to see the glittering green fire of the Thorne emeralds. The vault was empty. It wasn't just the emeralds. It was everything. Her grandmother's pearls, her private cash reserves, the bearer bonds her father had left her. Every single item of personal value had been stripped, leaving nothing but empty velvet-lined drawers. She stumbled back, a dry sob catching in her throat. Marcus hadn't just frozen her assets. He had liquidated her. He had taken her past, her inheritance, and her one tiny, secret escape fund. She had nothing. She wasn't just bait. She was completely disposable. At 2:58 p.m., Seraphina walked into the Illyrian Gallery. It was closed for a private event. The air was cold and still. "Julian," she called out, her voice echoing. She clutched the genuine but empty Cartier box to her chest. He stepped out from behind a large, abstract sculpture. He looked terrible. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face pale and unshaven, his dark eyes darting nervously. "You're late," he hissed, grabbing her arm. "Where are they? Give them to me." "They're in the box, Julian. Please, we have to go." He snatched the red box from her hands and tore it open. He stared at the empty velvet. His head snapped up, his face contorting in a mask of pure rage. You tricked me." "No, Julian, She didn't," said a voice from the mezzanine above them. The gallery's spotlights all snapped on at once, blinding them. Julian cried out, shielding his eyes. Seraphina looked up. Marcus Thorne stood on the balcony, flanked by 2 uniformed NYPD officers. His fixer, the anonymous man from the motel, stood in the doorway, blocking the only exit. "You did, Julian," Marcus said, his voice booming in the gallery. "You tricked yourself." Julian's face, illuminated by the harsh spotlights, cycled through a sickening montage of emotions. Confusion, raw fury, and finally, a pathetic animalistic panic. "Seraphina, you—" He lunged at her, not as a lover, but as an attacker. Before he could take a step, Marcus's fixer and another plainclothes operative had him pinned. his arms wrenched behind his back. The uniformed officers calmly walked forward, handcuffs at the ready. "Julian Vance," one officer recited, "you are under arrest for grand larceny and wire fraud." As they cuffed him, Julian's eyes locked on Marcus, who was descending the stairs slowly, his hands in his pockets. "You! Thorne! You set me up!" "You set yourself up," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the gallery. "You just needed a little push." He stopped a few feet away, looked at the con man, then turned his gaze to Seraphina. She was shaking, clutching the empty Cartier box. Marcus put a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that looked like comfort but felt like a brand. "Thank you, darling," he said, loud enough for the officers to hear. "I know that was terrifying. It's over." He guided his wife, his star witness, out of the gallery, leaving Julian screaming his rage at the unfeeling abstract art. The ride back to the penthouse was in Marcus's armored Maybach. The glass partition between them and the driver was up. The silence in the cabin was deafening, heavier than the bulletproof windows. Seraphina sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She had played her part. She had been the bait, the witness, the terrified wife. She waited for a word of acknowledgement, of thanks, of something. Marcus simply stared out the window, watching the lights of Manhattan blur past. He was checking stock tickers on his phone. "Marcus," she finally said, her voice small. He didn't look up. "You did well, Seraphina. Your performance was convincing." The word performance stung more than any insult. "So, what now? The accounts." "The legal process has begun," he said, finally turning to her. His eyes were flat like polished steel. "Your testimony will be required. After that, we will discuss the terms of your future." "My future?" "Of course," he said, as if surprised she would ask. "You are still Mrs. Thorne, for now. That title carries certain responsibilities, and," he added, a slight edge to his voice, "certain restrictions." The car pulled into their private garage. The King of Glass had brought his acquisition home. The following days were a new kind of prison. Seraphina was no longer physically locked in, but the gilded cage was stronger than ever. The household staff, who had once been invisible, now watched her with a mixture of pity and contempt. Hannon, Marcus's security chief, was her constant silent shadow. Her $5,000 credit card still worked. It was an allowance, a leash. She tried to meet a friend for lunch, a society woman she'd known for years. The woman's assistant called back to cancel, citing a sudden scheduling conflict. She tried another, and another. The calls were not returned. The news of the arrest and her involvement had clearly been selectively leaked. She was toxic. She was an outcast in her own life, trapped in a 10,000-square-foot penthouse with a man who looked at her as if she were a piece of faulty merchandise he was forced to keep. The humiliation was no longer public. It was a slow-acting internal poison. A week later, Marcus held a press conference. Seraphina stood beside him, her face pale, her hand in his. She was dressed in a conservative, high-necked navy dress, her hair pulled back. She looked every bit the victim. Marcus was magnificent. He was furious, righteous, and heartbroken. "This criminal," he boomed. "Julian Vance did not just attempt to defraud my foundation. He did something far more insidious. He preyed on the trusting nature of my wife." He squeezed Seraphina's hand. The cameras flashed. He exploited her kindness, her generosity, and for that he will face the full, unyielding force of the law. It was a masterpiece of narrative control. He had painted Seraphina as a naive, innocent victim. He had erased her agency, her affair, her betrayal, and replaced it with a story of a devoted wife who was too good for this world. He had saved his name, his reputation, and in doing so had trapped her completely. To deny his story would be to confess to the world that she was, in fact, an adulterer and a conspirator. Seraphina was a ghost. She drifted through the penthouse, her days a blur of silent meals, and staring out at the city that had rejected her. Her testimony was given, her part was played. Then one afternoon a package arrived. It wasn't from a courier. It was left by the service elevator, bypassing Hannon's security. Her name was written on it in elegant, unfamiliar cursive. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a single, flawless, pear-shaped emerald. She knew it instantly. It was the centerpiece from the emerald necklace. Her blood ran cold. She thought it was in an evidence locker or in Marcus's new secret vault. Underneath it was a simple, typewritten note. He didn't take everything, Seraphina. He just told you the vault was empty. He lied about Julian. He lied about the money, and he lied about the emeralds. Want to know what else he's hiding? Seraphina stared at the gem, a hard, glittering green eye. This wasn't the end of her husband's revenge. This was something else. She wasn't a disposable asset. She was a pawn in a much, much larger game. Seraphina's heart hammered against her ribs. The emerald felt cold and heavy in her palm, a solid, glittering piece of a puzzle she didn't understand. Hannon was outside her door. Marcus was in his study. She was being watched by everyone. She moved quickly, her mind racing. She couldn't hide it in her jewelry box, they would be checking. She couldn't put it in a safe. She had no access. She went to her bathroom, to a large, unopened jar of expensive face cream she'd been given months ago. She unscrewed the lid, dug her fingers into the thick white cream, and pushed the emerald deep inside until it was hidden. She smoothed the top, wiped the jar, and placed it back among the other bottles. It was a pathetic hiding place, but it was hers. The note, she memorized it and then tore it into tiny pieces, flushing it down the toilet. He lied about Julian. He lied about the money. He lied about the emeralds. She looked at her reflection. The pale, victimized wife from the press conference was gone. In her place was a woman with a secret. A new, terrifying energy sparked within her. She wasn't just a pawn. She was a player. The anonymous note had changed the architecture of her prison. Before, she had believed Marcus's narrative. Julian was a con man who had targeted her, and Marcus, in his cold, brutal way, had protected his assets. But if Marcus had lied, what was the truth? Why lie that the vault was empty? To break her spirit? To make her feel utterly dependent? He hadn't just secured his assets. He had performed a psychological demolition. And what did he lie about Julian? That Julian was just a con man? What if Julian was something more or something less? What if Julian himself was a pawn, just like her, set up by Marcus from the beginning? This thought was the most chilling of all. Had Marcus known about the affair and allowed it to continue, just to have the perfect excuse to ruin Julian and trap her? She looked out the penthouse window at the city. It wasn't just a cage, it was a chessboard, and she had an unknown ally. For 3 days, nothing. Seraphina played the part of the docile, broken wife. She was quiet at their silent dinners. She accompanied Marcus to a charity gala, smiling wanly for the cameras, her hand on his arm. Hannon watched her every move. At the gala, she went to the ladies' room. As she was washing her hands, an older, plainly dressed woman, a member of the catering staff, was wiping down the marble counter. As the woman passed her, she discreetly left a folded cocktail napkin by Seraphina's purse. "You dropped this, Mrs. Thorne." Seraphina's breath caught. She palmed the napkin. When she was alone in a stall, she opened it. More typewritten text. "He didn't liquidate your inheritance, he stole it. It's not in Geneva. Ask him about Project Icarus. See the king of glass fly too close to the sun." Project Icarus. It meant nothing to her. But the anonymous sender was clearly inside her world, able to breach Marcus's security at will. This was no friend. This was an enemy of her husband. Seraphina waited until the next morning. Marcus was in his study, finalizing the details of Julian's prosecution. He was in a good mood, the picture of a man who had won. She walked in without knocking. He looked up, annoyed. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "I was speaking with my family's lawyers. They had a question about the quarterly filings for my inheritance. I just wanted to make sure everything was in order with Project Icarus." She said it casually, as if it were a familiar term. Marcus froze. It was not a big reaction. He didn't drop his coffee, he didn't gasp, he simply stopped. The pen in his hand hovered over a document. All the air seemed to leave the room. He slowly, very slowly, lifted his eyes to meet hers. The cold, controlled mask was gone. Behind it was something she had never seen before. Pure, unadulterated fury. "Where?" he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Did you hear that name?" Seraphina almost flinched, but she held her ground. The fear she felt was overshadowed by a thrilling, terrible surge of power. She had hit him. She had drawn blood. I don't recall," she lied, feigning confusion. "Was it from your lawyers, or perhaps that nice Miss Davies, the forensic accountant?" Marcus stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Who have you been talking to, Seraphina?" he demanded, his voice no longer a growl, but a sharp, terrifying command. "No one," she said, taking a step back. "I'm not allowed to, remember?" He stared at her, his mind clearly racing, connecting the dots. Her sudden, impossible knowledge. The press conference. The gala. He was reassessing her. She was no longer a broken trinket. She was a threat. "Get out," he said. "Marcus, I said get out," he roared, sweeping his arm across his desk, sending a stack of documents and a glass of water crashing to the floor. Seraphina fled, her heart hammering. It wasn't a victory, it was a declaration of war. She had her husband's attention again, but this time, she had his fear. And she had an ally who was feeding her weapons. Seraphina didn't just retreat to her guest suite, she fled. The sound of Marcus roaring, the sound of breaking glass. It was the first time in their entire marriage he had ever lost his pristine, cold control. She locked her door, a laugh bubbling in her chest, half hysteria, half triumph. She had found a crack in the king of glass. But her triumph was short-lived. An hour later, her suite door beeped. Hannon entered, followed by two new men she'd never seen, dressed in his same style of dark, functional suit. "Mrs. Thorne," Hannon said, his voice flat, "we will be conducting a security sweep of your rooms." They were professional, quick, and invasive. They checked the light fixtures, the air vents, the back of the television. They ran a device over her phone, her tablet. They even opened her cosmetics, including the jar of face cream. Seraphina held her breath, but the scanner passed over it without incident. The emerald was non-metallic. The message was clear. Marcus was hunting for the leak. He was hunting for her ally. The penthouse was no longer a cage. It was a high-security prison. The atmosphere in the penthouse became suffocating. Marcus was a coiled spring of silent, contained rage. He didn't speak to Seraphina. He didn't even look at her. He was in constant hushed meetings with Hannon and his legal team. She watched from her window as Hannon's team was tripled. Men in black suits now patrolled their private elevator lobby. Her digital leash was tightened. Her $5,000 card was suddenly declined when she tried to order books online. She was completely isolated, cut off from the world. Her mysterious ally was gone, silenced by Marcus's new, suffocating security. The fear she'd felt before was nothing compared to this. Before, she was a prisoner of her husband's revenge. Now, she was a prisoner of his fear. He wasn't just angry about her betrayal anymore. He was terrified of Project Icarus. And he was terrified of her. This made him infinitely more dangerous. Days turned into a week of agonizing silence. Seraphina was on the verge of breaking, believing her ally had abandoned her. She was in the master gym, a room she hadn't used in weeks, staring at her own reflection in the giant wall-sized smart mirror. Hannon stood by the door, his arms crossed. Suddenly, the mirror's smart display, which usually showed her heart rate, flickered. Text scrolled across the bottom like a news ticker. "He's hunting. Don't use your phone. Project Icarus is an illegal shell corporation. He used it to buy the gallery where you trapped Julian. He used it to hide your inheritance. The proof isn't in his office. It's with the librarian. Find her." The text vanished as quickly as it appeared. The mirror returned to showing her reflection. Seraphina stared, her heart pounding. The librarian. It was a new breadcrumb. Her ally was still there, embedded in the very walls of her prison, and they had just confirmed her darkest suspicion. Julian's arrest was a complete fabrication, orchestrated by Marcus from the start. The librarian. The name meant nothing to her, but it was a target. She needed to get out. She needed to find this person. She couldn't fake an illness. Marcus would send his private doctor. She couldn't beg to see a friend. He knew she had none. So she stopped eating, It wasn't dramatic. She just stopped. She picked at her food at their silent dinners. She waved away the trays the staff brought her. Within 48 hours, the physical effects were noticeable. She looked gaunt, her skin pale, her hands shaking. She wasn't faking. She was desperate, and her body was obeying. Marcus finally noticed. He watched her across the dinner table as she pushed a single piece of asparagus around her plate. "You're being dramatic," he said. "I'm disappearing, Marcus," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "Just like you made my inheritance disappear. Just like you made me disappear. What's the point of eating if I'm already a ghost?" The next day he snapped, "You look terrible. It's bad for my image. Go buy some new clothes. Hannon will go with you." It was the first time she'd been allowed out in 2 weeks. It was a test, and it was her only chance. Bergdorf Goodman. He had chosen the most public, most opulent place, knowing she would be seen. Hannon stayed a respectable 3 feet behind her, a hawk watching a sparrow. Seraphina drifted through the designer racks, her mind racing. How could she find a librarian here? She moved to the fine jewelry counter, pretending to look at diamonds. I need to use the restroom," she said to Hannon, her voice weak. He nodded, gesturing to the public lounge. "I will be right outside the door." She walked in. The lounge was opulent, all marble and gold. A well-dressed woman was sitting on a velvet settee, reading a newspaper. As Seraphina passed, the woman stood up, blocking her path. She was in her 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind horn-rimmed glasses, and a severe gray bun. She looked like a professor. "Mrs. Thorne," the woman said, her voice low and crisp. Seraphina froze. Hannon was just outside. The woman held out a small, metallic object. It was a USB flash drive, disguised as a high-end lipstick. "I'm Miss Davies," the woman whispered. "The forensic accountant you mentioned, your librarian. We have a lot to talk about. Get this to a computer you don't own. The king of glass is about to fall." Seraphina's hand closed around the cold, metallic lipstick. "Get this to a computer you don't own." Ms. Davies' words were a death sentence if she failed. Hannon was just outside the door. "He'll be suspicious if we're both in here," Seraphina whispered, her mind racing. "Then give him a reason to be," Ms. Davies said. She grabbed Seraphina's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Make it count, Mrs. Thorne." Ms. Davies suddenly shoved her, hard against the marble wall. "Stay away from me," she yelled, her voice echoing in the lounge. Seraphina stumbled, crashing into a small table. A glass vase of orchids shattered on the floor. The door burst open. Hannon was there, his hand inside his jacket. He saw Miss Davies, furious, and Seraphina, pale and terrified, on the floor among the broken glass. "This woman is insane," Miss Davies snapped at Hannon. "She accused me of stealing in a Bergdorf's." Hannon's eyes darted between the two women. It was the perfect diversion. A catfight. A mundane rich wife problem. He was annoyed, not suspicious. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to—" "I'm leaving," Ms. Davies huffed, grabbing her purse. She shot one last venomous look at Seraphina. "You're a sad, pathetic creature, Mrs. Thorne." She brushed past Hannon and was gone. Hannon hauled Seraphina to her feet. "Are you done making a scene?" She was... Seraphina was genuinely shaking. She had to hide the USB, and fast. Hannon was pulling her toward the exit. I want to buy something," Seraphina said, yanking her arm free. "We're leaving." "No." Her voice was sharp, desperate. "I'm his wife. I am going to buy a dress. It's what I'm for." She stalked back to the dress racks, Hannon fuming behind her. She grabbed the first, most expensive dress she saw. A dark, severe, high-fashion piece. She didn't go to the dressing room. She walked to the register. "I'll wear it," she told the stunned sales associate. "Ma'am? I'll wear it out now." Hannon was confused. This was new. She went behind a privacy screen, Hannon standing guard just outside. She tore off her victim dress and pulled on the new armor-like one. And in that moment of privacy, she took the lipstick USB and tucked it deep into the one place she knew he would never look. Her own hair, which she twisted into a tight, severe bun, the small device acting as the pin. She emerged, a completely different woman. "Now," she said to Hannon, "we can go." She couldn't go back to the penthouse. Not with this in her hair. As they walked to the car, she saw her opportunity. A high-end mail courier service, 2 doors down from the department store. "I need to send a gift," she said, walking toward it. "Mrs. Thorne, we are not... Are you going to physically restrain me on 5th Avenue, Hannon? Is that the new policy?" She was betting on his fear of a public scene. She won. She walked inside the shop. Hannon followed, standing by the door. "I need a small box and overnight shipping," she told the clerk. She went to the private wrapping station. She pulled the lipstick from her hair, her hands shaking so hard she almost dropped it. She put it in the box, filled out the shipping label, and addressed it to Sarah Smith at a public library branch in Queens. An address Ms. Davies had whispered to her in the chaos. "That'll be 85, the clerk said. She pulled out her card. Hannon watched. She knew what would happen. The clerk ran it. "I'm sorry, ma'am, it's declined." The public humiliation. Hannon's lip curled in a tiny, satisfied smirk. "Fine," Seraphina said, her voice dripping ice. She slipped off the diamond watch Marcus had given her for their anniversary. "This is a Patek Philippe. It's worth more than your entire shop. Hold it as collateral until my husband pays my allowance again." The clerk's eyes went wide. Hannon was furious. She had defied him and created a paper trail of his cruelty. "The package will go out today?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely." Hannon all but threw her into the Maybach. The ride home was silent and violent. He reported everything to Marcus on the phone in front of her. She sent a package, a lipstick, to a Sarah Smith in Queens. "Yes, sir." She used her watch as collateral. When she arrived, Marcus was waiting in the foyer. He wasn't enraged, he was impressed. "A Patek," he said, almost smiling. "That was dramatic and clever. You created a witness to my control. Well done." "It was just a gift," she said, her voice small. "Of course it was," he said, circling her. "But you know, Seraphina, I own that courier company, or at least the holding company that owns it. It took one call to have your little package of lipstick intercepted. It's on its way here right now." Seraphina's blood turned to ice. She had failed, she had lost, all that for nothing. "You see," Marcus said, leaning in, "you can't ever beat me. You live in my world. You breathe my air. Every move you make I've already anticipated." "You're a monster," she whispered, tears of defeat welling. "I'm a king," he corrected her. "And you, my dear, are about to learn what happens to traitors." The private elevator dinged. Hannon walked in, holding the small intercepted package. Marcus took the package, a look of ultimate triumph on his face. He held it up for her to see. "The last nail in your coffin, my love." He tore it open. He pulled out the lipstick. He clicked it open. It was a lipstick. A simple, bright red Chanel lipstick. Seraphina stared, her mind blank. Marcus's smile faltered. He looked at her, confused. He broke the lipstick, sniffing it. He smashed it on the marble table. It was just makeup. "What is this?" he demanded. "What game is this?" Seraphina was as stunned as he was. And then she remembered. Ms. Davies, the shove, the 2 lipsticks in her bag. The chaos as she'd dropped her purse in the restroom. Ms. Davies hadn't given her the lipstick. She had swapped it. While Hannon was bursting in, while Seraphina was on the floor, Ms. Davies had helped her put her things back in her bag. She had taken the real USB and left a decoy. The whole trip, the mail, the watch. It was all a diversion. A diversion Ms. Davies had planned. The USB wasn't in the mail. It was with the librarian. Seraphina looked at her husband, at his confusion and rage. And for the first time in her life, she began to laugh. A real, genuine, unrestrained laugh. Marcus stared at her, his face darkening. He had been played, and so had she. Seraphina's laughter died in her throat. Marcus's face, which had been a mask of confusion, settled into a new, terrifying calm. It was the calm of a king who had just watched a peasant land a lucky blow and was now deciding how to execute them. "So," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "you have a friend." He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He turned to Hannon, who was still holding the box with the smashed lipstick. "Hannon," Marcus said, "Mrs. Thorne's privileges are revoked, all of them. She is no longer to be considered my wife. She is to be considered a hostile asset. Full containment protocol." "Sir?" Hannon looked surprised. She does not leave her suite. Her communication devices, all of them, are to be removed. The smart mirror, the television, her phone, her tablet, everything. She will have no contact with the outside world. Do you understand? Yes, sir. She's a security risk, Marcus said, his cold eyes locking on Seraphina. We will treat her as such. Seraphina's blood ran cold. This wasn't a punishment. This was an internment. Within 10 minutes, Hannon's team had swept her suite, unplugging and removing every piece of technology, leaving her in a Gilded Age prison. The small, exhilarating victory was gone, replaced by a suffocating, silent terror. Days. That's all Seraphina had to mark the time. The sun rose, the sun set. Her meals were left by the door of her suite. She was completely, utterly isolated. The penthouse, once a symbol of her status, was now a tomb. She had no way to know if Ms. Davies was safe. She had no way to know what was on the USB drive. She was cut off, blind, and buried alive, right in the heart of Manhattan. Marcus was hunting. She knew it. He was tearing his company apart, looking for the librarian. He was using his vast resources to find the source of the leak, to find the woman who had helped her. She paced her silent rooms, her new dress her only armor. She had to believe. Ms. Davies was too smart to get caught. She had planned the lipstick diversion. She had a bigger plan. Seraphina's role in this new war was not to act. It was to endure. It was to wait. And it was to be the bait that would, she prayed, eventually draw her husband into the light. Miles away, in a nondescript office in Queens, Ms. Davies, Sarah Davies, a woman whose entire family had been financially ruined by one of Marcus's early, predatory raids, plugged the real USB into a secure laptop. The drive unlocked. It was a digital fortress, but Ms. Davies was the one who had built the original Icarus database for Marcus before he'd pushed her out. She knew the back doors. The files bloomed on her screen. Project Icarus. It was worse than she'd imagined. Marcus hadn't just hidden Seraphina's inheritance. He had used it as illegal, untraceable seed capital. He'd leveraged her family's old money trust to fund a series of brutal corporate raids, buying companies, stripping them of their assets and firing thousands of employees, all while the money was supposedly in a secure vault in Geneva. He had turned Seraphina's clean legacy into a dirty weapon. And then Ms. Davies found the final folder. Operational expenses. A series of wire transfers to an untraceable shell company. A shell company that, with a few cross-references, she linked to one man, Julian Vance. "Oh, Mrs. Thorne," Ms. Davies whispered to the empty room. "He wasn't just a con man, he was an employee." The next morning, a star financial journalist at the New York Times, known for her tenacity, received an anonymous, encrypted email. Subject: The King of Glass is a fraud. The email contained one attachment. A single, verified, and utterly damning ledger from Project Icarus. It showed the initial illegal transfer from Seraphina Thorne's trust, and it showed the payment for the first hostile takeover. The journalist's phone was on the line to Marcus's head of PR within minutes. Marcus was in a board meeting, discussing his brilliant acquisition of the new art gallery, when his phone buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Finally, he looked. A dozen missed calls from his PR chief. He excused himself, annoyed, and took the call. "Sir," his PR chief said, his voice high with panic, "The Times is on the other line. They have a document from something called Project Icarus. They are asking if you used your wife's inheritance to fund the Avaline acquisition. Sir, they're running the story. In 1 hour." The King of Glass felt the tower crack beneath his feet. Marcus didn't run. He walked with a terrible, contained speed from his office down the private hall and burst into Seraphina's suite. She was on the sofa reading a book. He threw his tablet at her. It clattered on the marble coffee table. The screen was open to the New York Times homepage. The headline, still in pre-publication, read, "The Thorne Legacy. A wife's fortune, a husband's fraud. You," he roared, all his cold control shattered. "You and your pet accountant, you think you can destroy me?" Seraphina stared at the headline, her heart hammering. It was working. Ms. Davies was working. She read the first paragraph, and then the second. The article mentioned the ledger, it mentioned the illegal transfer, and then it mentioned a sub-ledger showing payments to a shell company owned by a consultant named Julian Vance. Seraphina looked up from the tablet, her eyes wide, all the blood draining from her face. She finally understood. "You paid him," she whispered, the horror dawning. "What?" Marcus was still raging about the money. "Julian, the affair, the love, the betrayal." She stood up, her voice shaking. You hired him. You paid him to seduce me." The cheating wasn't her rebellion. It was his script. It wasn't her sin, it was his strategy. This was the true violation. This was the moment she stopped being a victim and started being his executioner. Marcus stared at her, his rage momentarily eclipsed by his surprise. He hadn't expected her to put that piece together. Not this fast. "He was an asset," Marcus finally hissed, all pretense of a marriage gone. "Just like you, a tool to manage a risk." Seraphina felt the last shred of her past shatter. "A risk? I was your wife." "You were my greatest acquisition," he roared, jabbing a finger at her. "And my most flawed. I knew you would break. I knew you would betray me. It's in your nature. You're weak. So, I controlled the narrative. I hired him to be the man you thought you wanted, to give you a cage you'd choose to walk into. I was going to let you have your little affair, discover it, and then I would own you forever, bound by your own shame." He laughed, a cold, dry sound. "And now you've ruined it. You've ruined everything." "No, Marcus," Seraphina said, her voice shaking but hardening into steel. "You just confessed. You didn't manage a risk. You created one, and you just armed me." He lunged, grabbing the tablet from her, but it was too late. The New York Times article was live. The world knew. The fallout was instantaneous. It wasn't just an article, it was an avalanche. The Times piece was followed by a Wall Street Journal exclusive, detailing the Project Icarus Shell Corporation. By noon, Thorne Enterprises stock was in free fall, plummeting 60%. Marcus was trapped in the penthouse, a king in a burning castle. Seraphina, still locked in her suite, watched the drama unfold on the tablet he had left behind, her one remaining window to the world. She watched, mesmerized, as live news helicopters swarmed their building. The SEC had formally announced an investigation. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting. Thorne Enterprises' assets were frozen. Marcus was on the phone, not as a king, but as a desperate man. He was screaming at his lawyers, his bankers, his PR team. "Fix it! I don't care how, just fix it!" Seraphina saw it in his eyes, reflected in the glass of her prison. It wasn't just rage anymore. It was the white-knuckled, cold sweat terror of a man who had just lost control. He was no longer the king of glass. He was just a man, trapped in the tower he'd built. For 2 days, the penthouse was a war room. Marcus, disheveled, his suit jacket off, his tie ripped away, paced the foyer, surrounded by his remaining legal team. Hannon was nowhere to be seen. On the 3rd day, silence. The phones stopped ringing, the lawyers left. The SEC had filed its first round of charges. Seraphina's door chimed. She hadn't heard that sound in a week. She stood back as Hannon, his face gray and defeated, opened the door. "Mrs. Thorne, you have a visitor. He has been cleared by the SEC. I was instructed to allow him access." Seraphina stepped out of her suite, her heart pounding. She expected to see Ms. Davies, but it was Julian. He wasn't the suave, charming art dealer. He was dressed in an ill-fitting suit, his hair a mess, his face pale. He looked pathetic. "Seraphina," he said, his voice cracking. I had to see you. I'm so sorry." Marcus emerged from his office, his face a mask of thunder. You're supposed to be in Panama, you ignorant." "He's here as a witness for the SEC, Mr. Thorne," Hannon said, his voice dead. "And so am I." It was Hannon's betrayal that finally broke Marcus. He sank into a chair, staring as Julian and Hannon stood with Seraphina. "He forced me," Julian said, his eyes fixed on Seraphina, ignoring Marcus completely. "He found me when I was drowning in debt. He paid me. He scripted it. The chance meeting, the shared interests, the rare painting, it was all him." You told me you loved me," Seraphina whispered, the words tasting like acid. I think I did, Julian said, his eyes filling with tears. That was the part he didn't plan on. I was supposed to get you to sign papers to give him leverage. But when the Icarus leak started, he panicked. He wired me a final payment and told me to run to Panama, or I'd be buried with him. But Ms. Davies, your librarian, she found me first. She offered me a deal. Immunity, if I came back and told the truth. About you. About everything. Hannon stepped forward. She found me too, Mrs. Thorne. She showed me what he was planning. He was going to use me as the scapegoat for Project Icarus. He was going to send me to prison. It was over. Marcus Thorne, the King of Glass, was alone, surrounded by the ghosts he had created. He looked up not at Julian, not at Hannon, but at Seraphina. He saw the cold, hard strength in her eyes, the woman he had called a flaw. So, Marcus said with a final desperate attempt at control, this is your revenge. You've won. You've destroyed me. You destroyed yourself, Marcus, Seraphina said, walking over to the tablet still on the table. You just couldn't stand to see a single beautiful thing without wanting to own it, and you couldn't own anything without breaking it. What now, Seraphina? He sneered. You'll be left with nothing. The government will take it all. Not everything, Seraphina said. She picked up the tablet. Ms. Davies is a very thorough accountant. She found the real ledgers, the ones that prove my inheritance was used illegally before it was commingled. It's clean. My family's, at least. She turned the tablet on. It wasn't the news. It was a live video feed. Ms. Davies was on the screen along with two men in dark suits, agents from the SEC. We've been listening for the last 10 minutes, Mr. Thorne. Ms. Davies's voice came through the speaker. Your full confession regarding Mr. Vance and your intent to defraud your wife has been recorded. We're in the lobby. Seraphina looked at her husband, the man who had cost her everything, and she gave him one last cold smile. His revenge, she said to the screen, cost him everything. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel to watch more from our upcoming stories. Thank you for watching.